Today's presenter is Jeff Gorder, Vice President of Crisis Response Clinical Services for R3 Continuum. Jeff brings more than 30 years of clinical experience, including consultation and extensive on-site critical incident response to businesses and communities. He's responded directly to the September 11th terrorist attacks, Hurricane Katrina, the Virginia Tech shootings, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the earthquake/tsunami in Japan a few years back, the Newtown tragedy, and the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, as well as the Las Vegas shooting. So thank you for being with us here today, Jeff. Today's webinar will be covering questions that were asked by the audience during registration. Like I mentioned before, if you don't see your question being answered or have additional questions, please let us know in the Q&A box. If there's time at the end, we'll be able to address some of those as well. At this time, I'm going to toss it over to Jeff. Jeff, can you get us started and give us kind of a rundown of what we're currently seeing regarding stress and how it's affecting folks?
Yeah, thank you, Shane. And thank you all for taking this time and for joining this webinar. I think that this is an opportune time, the appropriate moment. It feels as if we are at a point of transition. I want to be careful and cautious that I'm not saying by any means that we are done with COVID or that we've come out of the pandemic and it's finished, even though for many of us it might feel that way. For others, there is still potentially other waves coming. But having said all that, it feels like this is an appropriate time to stop and take stock of where do we go from here? The aftermath of any disruption. What have we learned from past disruptions, and how can we apply that in our current setting? And my contention throughout this is that this is the moment. This is when savvy business leaders realize this isn't about just stumbling past the last crisis and hope that the next one doesn't come. This is the moment where I invest in, I speak into the culture of my workplace. This is the opportunity to really help shape what an emotionally healthy workplace looks like. And I think that as we go through this, we'll see ways that we can do that. Now, I want to start by sort of setting the table and sharing some hot off the presses research that came out. Some of you may have seen this. The American Psychological Association, for the last 15 years, has conducted a Stress in America survey. They send out questionnaire to a large sample size, and they begin to capture, so what is trying to gauge the level of stress in a general sense. And this was released just last week. So the 22 survey results showed that what was remarkable about it is that it was the highest level of stress recorded in the 15 years of asking these questions. And not surprisingly, the stresses were related to the rising costs and prices that we're all seeing in various levels at the store and at the pump, supply chain issues for those in manufacturing, global uncertainty as things seem to be more confusing or uncertain than previously. And a lot of that is related, of course, to the actions of Russia and Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. But here's the thing that I want to highlight. As they continue to ask these questions, 87% of the respondents say that it feels as if there has been a constant stream of crises without a break over the last 2 years. Now, that is a Captain Obvious moment to clearly say that, but I think it's incredible and I think we need to stop and take stock here for a second. 87% say that it's been a constant stream. It has been no longer sort of the singular self-contained event that strikes. And yes, that was difficult, and yes, it was challenging, but we were able to see when did it start, when did it stop, and we were able to move forward. What these last 2 years have shown us is that disruption occurs sometimes overlapping, sometimes on top of each other, sometimes cumulatively. And the reality is that every disruption occurs in a context. And what I want to highlight here is that it occurs in the context of the unique history, the unique culture of your organization, of your business. That organization has a culture, and how we respond to it, how we respond to future ones, is in many ways based on how we responded to the last ones. And that's, again, heart of the matter that I want to talk about today, and we're going to address that further as we move along. Now, as I said, it's kind of a transition point. We do seem to be at a bit of a crossroads. Reintegration is happening. And this survey also just recently released last month from Castle Real Estate. It's a group that is one of the largest managers of commercial and office real estate. And what they highlighted, and I hope you can see this here, is that there is a return to normal. What we've seen, this being the precipitous drop that we all remember at the beginning of the pandemic and when everything was shut down, and that each line indicates a certain key industry that highlights a return to some sense of normalcy. And interestingly enough, the one industry that has shown the most quickest response to return, with a 93% return to pre-event, to pre-COVID attendance, is NBA basketball. So more people were just starving to get back there and see NBA, but 93% of that has responded. Around 78% return to previous operations at TSA checkpoints, which again means people are flying again, and there's more travel going on. Around 67% return as measured by Open Table Reservation app, as one kind of blunt metric to be able to see, well, how many people are returning to restaurants again. So about 67%. 58% have returned to theaters and are seeing movies again in the traditional big box theaters. But 31% have returned to the office. And I think that, again, is striking. So I think we can say, okay, why is that happening? And there's a variety of things that can go into that. But I think what I see as an opportunity with this statistic is, again, a savvy business leader will understand this is my chance. This is the moment where I can shape and influence what comes next. That this is inevitably, we're going to be either moving to a hybrid version, to an on-site version, to some return to the office, to traditional business modalities. And here's my chance. Now is the moment to speak into that. So the questions that we've got, I think, speak to that. And so let's roll to those.
Yeah, and I think like you said, if those graphs were a little small to be able to read, we do have these slides download. You're able to download those from the resource widget. One interesting point that you were just saying, Jeff, is with travel. I heard that the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport, I believe it was yesterday or the day prior, had like their busiest day of the last 2.5 years. So exactly what you said, people are starting to get out there, especially around this kind of, spring break time. But jumping into this, like you said, with question one, these last 2 years have taken a toll on my employees. How can I, as a leader, help them pass the trauma?
Excellent question, and one that I think so many businesses are wrestling with. They're like, okay, I know we need to address this, but I want to put out a caution. I want to have a caveat in here. I want to encourage leaders to avoid presuming or projecting on trauma. Trauma is a very distinct designation. I think it's been so used over these last 2 years in so many situations that whenever a word means so many things in so many situations, it begins to have almost no meaning. And that trauma is a powerful and distinct situation. I remember hearing somebody say that, I went to Starbucks and they were out of my favorite beverage, and you know what, I was traumatized. Really? I'm not sure that rises to the designation of trauma. And so I want to highlight, though, that yes, it has been undoubtedly, undeniably stressful, challenging, as those research showed us earlier. And so it has been difficult, but I don't want to suggest anything or come at this as if to say that everybody automatically then has, of course, been traumatized because of this. I think as we have shown in previous presentations, any of you who have seen them, that resilience is the dominant trajectory. That research has shown time and again that most people will respond in a resilient fashion. and recover to that. Now, again, something that is important to recognize, because resilience doesn't necessarily mean happiness all the time. That I face this challenge with, with a song on my voice and a step, a jaunty step. No, of course not. Resilience doesn't mean happiness. Resilience means that I have experienced the full range of emotions appropriate to the event, consistent with the event. That is what's called, getting a little bit clinical here, but that's what's called regulatory flexibility. It's that ability, that aspect of each of us, that attribute, to be able to say, when it is time to be sad, I'm able to be sad. When it is time to be upset at issues that I feel are unjust, that's the time to be upset. If I am, and when it's time to be happy, it's time to be happy. And so it's not about having sort of one unified emotional approach as if happiness is always it. It's important to recognize that, of course, we've all experienced a range of emotions in these last 2 years. And what I think is key to this is recognizing that distress, while unavoidable, and growth aren't opposites. I think so often we tend to think of, oops, I'm sorry, I think I skipped one here. That we tend to think of them as binary, as like one or the other. And I want to just do a quick review. Some of you, and I presented this in previous presentations, but I think in our current discussion, it's important. I am not in any way advocating what has come to be called toxic positivity. That sort of, the suppression or dismissal of negative emotions, where it tends to lead others to feel that they are invalidated, or that the emotions they're experiencing aren't in some ways legitimate. And so, you can often tell that toxic positivity is that sort of performative platitude, the kind of thing that we all had in our adolescent posters that we hung up on our walls or our lockers, the kind of thing in the hang in there, you can do it, tough it out, come on, it could always be worse, don't worry, be happy. That toxic positivity is not at all what I'm advocating, because that obviously diminishes trust and leadership. But what I am highlighting here, and what I don't want to in any way minimize, is post-traumatic growth. The recognition that positive change through the life experiences of facing a struggle and overcoming that struggle, enduring that struggle, persevering through that struggle, results almost always with a sense of growth. Not every time, but it almost always results in a sense of growth. It acknowledges and validates the very real pain that one through, but also validates and acknowledges the efforts made to survive, cope, and persevere. It's closely aligned with meaning attribution. What meaning do I put on this? Which is an expression of resilience. And it's to not only see the pain, but to see beyond the pain. Now, I share all this because, as I said, we tend to think of distress or growth as binary, as one end of a pole or the other. It's either you got one or you got the other. There's no, or somewhere in between. But the reality is that they coexist. And this was some recent research that I think speaks so powerfully into this moment. Post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic depreciation, the stress that we experience during a stressful time, can coexist. And so what this research found is that the elements of post-traumatic growth, the spiritual and existential challenges, the why, the big why questions, the appreciation that I have for life and the value of life, my appreciation for the relationships I have and the close loved ones in my sphere, the sense that challenges bring about new possibilities. I learned things about myself that I never would have thought that I could do until I was faced with this challenge. And what this research found is that the depreciation was powerful in all these areas, but so was the growth. And in fact, one can extrapolate that the stronger the depreciation, the stronger the growth. Again, I am not in any ways minimizing that. I am not minimizing the pain that was endured when they went through it. But the research is pretty powerful, that going through these difficult times also leads us to periods of individual and organizational growth as a result. And I think that's something that's powerful, and we need to acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, and I love that idea that you're mentioning. You can't just sweep this under the rug. We can't go into this next year and say like, oh, what happened the last 2? You got to remember it. You got to kind of build off of it. Exactly what you're saying is that we're not going to forget this, overnight. It's something that we got to look at as a growing opportunity. And I love to hear that. The second question here that we've got from the audience, what do you anticipate the biggest struggles for employees will be as COVID restrictions are removed?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And again, it's a very practical, a very pragmatic question. And I want to begin, again, I'm not trying to be trivial about it, but I want to extend much grace and no judgment on whatever we needed to do to get through these last 2 years, whatever got us through this dark night of the soul, whatever we had to do, we struggled to cope with the challenges that have been thrown at us. Again, I think it's important for leaders to come at it with much grace and no judgment. But having said that, it is important to recognize, and there's been, many of you have heard reports to this effect, that there have been a number of negative patterns, negative habits that have developed over the course of that time, things that maybe were, last-ditch efforts that we did to cope during the course of this, but they no longer work in our new and current context as we begin to move forward. And some of those, again, have been well publicized. I begin with negative habits around our physical health, recognizing that emotional health is closely aligned with our physical health, with our bodies. And there have been many, many reports that have indicated the increase in alcohol and substance use during the past 2 years. Many people report weight gain or decrease in physical activity. And so I think it's important for leaders to recognize that we're only going to be as healthy as our bodies are. And that we need to be able to promote that, intentionally promote physical health through our strategic messaging. This is a time, I think, to reintroduce wellness programs, EAP programs that have and connecting some incentivizing the utilization of those programs, because they speak to this moment. That is the expertise they bring. And many organizations have found it helpful. There are just a slew of apps and other programs that gamify health activities. Make it something like a competition between, a friendly competition between teams or between organizations, or things where you, by doing certain activities, you gain, you gain badges or status or levels, things where we can make it, gamify it so that it's more part of our reintegration into a more positive perspective on life. Now, having said that, there are also negative habits that have built up around the way we operate corporately, our corporate body, our organization. And for many organizations, it was hard to avoid getting a negative groupthink over these last 2 years. Just kind of it was hard to muster up a sense of energy, excitement, enthusiasm, particularly, in the most difficult times, and certainly before vaccinations, when it was like we were all just waiting, and there's a chance that some patterns kind of set in. And again, savvy leaders are aware of that and are watching for that, because some groups can even take that to an extreme, what we call reflexive catastrophizing, where we're going to face challenges coming up. There's no doubt. It's not as if now we get a get out of jail free card. Of course, we're going to face additional challenges as we go forward, but there's a sense where we could reflexively, here it is again. Oh my goodness, yet another thing. Oh my, kind of the old Eeyore approach from Winnie the Pooh. We're doomed. We're never going to make it. And taking every new challenge and blowing it up, magnifying it as if it is yet one more thing. And so we need to make sure that we are not falling into a pattern of reflexive catastrophizing. I think, no surprise, another pattern that has come to develop and that many organizations are wrestling with is the polarization. And particularly when we're talking about what reintegration looks like, because there are those who are beyond ready to put COVID behind us and are just rushing towards we're past it, and others who are understandably cautious, who are not yet quite ready to do that, or are doing that in a slower or more thoughtful position. For myself, having lost 2 family members to COVID, I want to offer much grace and much space to those who are still working through that and are trying to make sense out of this. And I think savvy business leaders who are investing in an emotionally healthy culture recognize that I need to have flexibility, understanding in this. I need to encourage folks to be gracious with each other as we are returning to what the next normal looks like, not the old normal, but the next normal. And again, that part of that is because there's this rush to normalcy. I kind of referenced that earlier, that this desire it's human nature that when I've been going through something negative, uncomfortable, distressing, powerful in that way, I want to skip to the end of the story, to the happy ending. I want to get past this as quickly as I can. And there is a rush to normalcy, which is, again, human nature, understandable. Who wants to sit and linger in the pain? Nobody. But if we rush to normal, we will skip over the acknowledgement, the recognition that some things are changed. Some things will never quite be the same. And so I have to expect and acknowledge sadness, frustration, even anger that may come from this, or grief, as there are certain things, processes, and ways that we interact that may not go back to what I used to value and used to enjoy. And so it's, again, important for leaders to be intentional, and for each of us as individuals to be intentional, to ask ourselves the question, what do we want to carry forward? What worked? What did we do well? And to ask myself, what no longer works in this new phase? To be able to give myself the time to, again, let go of some of those negative habits or patterns that no longer work, and to intentionally remind ourselves of what did work. We're going to need, for many organizations, need to relearn some of the social interactions in a new context. Is everybody back on site? Some units, some teams, some departments may be back on site, and others are continuing to operate remotely. Many organizations are allowing their employees to experiment with a hybrid approach. I'm coming in on some days and working remotely on others. So how do we remain connected, knowing that we may have a workforce that is operating in several different modalities? What we have seen, again, reminding ourselves, we know from the last 2 years that we are able to work remotely. It has been amazing how much we were still able to do, even when we almost overnight transitioned to a remote workforce. And now we are coming back to on-site again. And there are many organizations that never left. Healthcare and food service, and other organizations that had maintained first responders, that had to maintain on-site direct service throughout. And so for them, they're like, I've made this, but maybe some of their other folks, administrative, logistical, leadership, are only now just coming back on site. So recognizing that we are still in a time of transition on that. Something that I think may seem trivial, but I think, again, it's important to give some thought and intentionality to what kind of team building activities are advisable, acceptable, or comfortable for everybody at this point. I think a simple example might be, I was having this conversation with some of our coworkers about one of the things we most enjoyed that was part of our culture beforehand were things like potlucks around certain activities. And I'm probably thinking about St. Patrick's Day only because we just recently had it, but also because that was when we shut down. That was when we made the decision to operate remotely. And the first time I came back into the office, we had all the St. Patrick's Day things were still up. And, the notice on the board about when the St. Patrick's potluck, and bring your where we're going to have a potato bar and all kinds of things that we, have come to think these are fun team building social activities. Is a potluck something that is acceptable, is comfortable for an organization at this point? Many organizations have moved to saying we're going to do similar things, but we're going to cater it. We're going to bring in prepared food made, by professionals, so that just adds a level of safety or comfort for folks. There's not a right or wrong way to do this. I'm just saying, don't assume that everybody feels exactly the same way. It's important to be intentional and to think about it. Similarly, with external stakeholders, what are the levels of comfort? What is advisable or acceptable with my customers, with my clients, with my suppliers? Am I aware of what their evolving expectations or limits or policies are around face-to-face meetings, or about conferences, or about other things like that? And so again, I don't want to, in our rush to normalcy, skip some of these things that could be stumbling blocks later on. And I think a key to this is leveraging the power of purpose. I think that many organizations are finding that reviewing and promoting once again the company's mission, our purpose, serves as a compass during times of disruption. Companies are finding that having a higher meaning is a stabilizing focal point, both for executive decisions as well as frontline pragmatic operations. Knowing what our purpose is, what our mission is a unifying force, not only for internal stakeholders, our employees, but also our external stakeholders, our supply chain vendors, our customers, the community at large, corporate stakeholders. And by keeping our why front and center, we are communicating not only what we're doing it and why we're doing it. And for many of you, if you ever saw the TED Talk or are familiar with the work from Simon Sinek on the power of why, I encourage you to take a look at that. But keeping the why front and center is more than just, okay, it gives us our marching orders and gets us through the day and the week and the month, but it also intimately shapes the culture. Having a why is the groundwork on which an emotionally healthy company is built. An emotionally healthy workforce knows why they're showing up every day. They know why they are putting in the extra efforts and why they are striving for excellence, because they know the why. They have the larger meaning, what it is we are striving to do. That knowing it, the purpose, also puts the adaptations or sacrifices we've made in a larger context. I'm willing to go through temporary pain if I know that this leads to long-term gain. If I know that this is something that will pay off, there's a reason why we had to make some changes, some alterations, why I may not be happy with the way it stands exactly right now. But if I understand this in the bigger context of why, then it makes more sense, and I am more willing to make those kind of adaptations. And having a why in a very subtle but I think powerful way casts a vision of the future beyond the disruption. It begins to remind us that this moment, as powerful as it was, as compelling as it has been, is not the end of the story. And that our purpose, our mission, helps us begin to think, here's what we're going to do tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. As we move forward, we have a meaning, a larger purpose, and that is not only sustaining, it is protective as well. And it helps to be able to move forward.
Yeah, I love that. That was some great, good perspective for anybody in any industry. So I like that. Thank you for that one, Jeff. Our next question here: what have other companies done to reset following disruptive events, or as they transition to post-COVID and beyond?
Excellent. So I think I kind of reference back. I think there is, I referenced the negative patterns, negative habits that may have built in, something that I think many organizations are wrestling with and have learned that they need to make some changes with are the problem-focused perspective that developed over the last 2 years. And goodness knows there were many problems that we had to focus on. So it's not surprising. And again, there's no judgment in this, but to be aware of and to really stop and think, what negative habits, patterns have developed. And for many of them, they have come to realize that they were approaching things from a deficit-based approach. And what I'm getting at, again, is something that is very nuanced, but it's about the narrative. Whenever it's human nature that whenever we go through a difficult time, we build a narrative, we build a story. Here's where we were, here's what happened, here's how we got through it, here's where we're going now. All organizations, all individuals, when faced with a challenge, kind of develop an internal narrative. What is the story? How did we get through this? And an intentional narrative is going to have a focus. A leader recognizes that they can help shape that narrative to develop the emotionally healthy workplace. So that's the context in which I'm looking at this, because there are many organizations unintentionally developed a deficit-based narrative, an approach that defined the people, the groups, the situations by the problems, struggles, and failures that they faced. So saying things, again, if I think of this in a narrative and a story-like fashion, if only X hadn't have happened, why then everything would have been better. Or, what, we would have, could have, should have done X, Y, Z instead, looking back with regret and self-recrimination. Or, I'm so glad we're done with that. Let's get back to the way it used to be. Let's go back to how exactly it was. And that is a negative, a deficit-based narrative that is not going to be particularly effective for most organizations. What successful organizations have found is that if they begin to have an intentional narrative that is asset framing, and I want to pause here because asset framing is an approach that has been applied in a variety of contexts. It's often around community development, diversity, equity, inclusion, perspectives around long-term care settings, but I think it is particularly apt and fitting for this moment. That savvy leaders, again, that intentionally create a narrative around asset framing, which means I define people, groups, situations, teams by their aspirations, by their contributions, by their achievements. I don't start by saying, well, here's how we failed, or here's what we didn't do, here's how we dropped the ball. I begin by saying, here's what we accomplished, here's how we got through it. So again, what did we do to get through these last 2 years? Celebrate it, acknowledge it, and celebrate it. What did we learn about ourselves, about each other, about our community? Honor that. What things can we take away from that? And how did we grow, adapt, change? How did we cope with it? Build on that. Build on it, and build on the things that are working well and the things that are continuing to move you forward. I think one key way to do that is through appreciative inquiry. And so this is a concept, again, many of you may be familiar to this. It's not a new concept, but again, I think it is uniquely suited to this moment of transition, that if I am, as a leader, trying to think of what can I do, how can I, what's a model? How can I pragmatically influence this? It's one thing to say in an intentional narrative. That sounds great. How do I do it? Appreciative inquiry, I think, is a successful model that has been proven in other circumstances and applies well now. And so you'll see how it fits in with asset framing, is that I have to ask, first off, I have to determine, okay, what issue is it that we're looking to resolve? What issue is in front of us? What's the challenge that we need to adapt to? And I begin with the questions, well, what is going well? What things that we have done that are working right? Then I move to dreaming. I ask the question, what else might be possible? What else can we do? What would be better? What could improve upon that? And then the next step would be to design. Well, what would that look like? What specific things, what specific actions could we begin to take that would move us towards these new areas, and then delivery. What will we have to do to get there? What kinds of actions steps can we put in place? And then continually revisiting that appreciative inquiry that says, okay, so after we've implemented this new plan, this new approach, this new narrative, saying, after a period of time, regularly coming back and saying, how is it working? Is it achieving what we like? If it is, then let's keep doing it. If we think it's kind of there, but you know what, we need to add some things or do some additional stuff to get us even further, great. So then we adapt or alter the plan. Or if we say, you know what, we've tried this, it's not working, let's go back to the drawing board and start over again. But appreciative inquiry as a regular pattern allows you to assess, is it working? Keep doing it. Is it kind of working? Let's add some things to make it do more. If it's not working, let's change. But that has to be intentional. It has to be a part of the plan. And what I so like about appreciative inquiry is that I think this, again, is a protective antidote against the negative patterns, the negative habits that may have developed over the last 2 years. It's a new way of thinking, and it deeply invests in the health of the workplace. It shapes your culture. You want a workforce that operates from these marching orders, not ones that continue to operate from the negative perspectives that developed over the last 2 years. Now, part of this, and because many of you know, of course, that R3, one of our central service offerings, is disruptive event management, or providing that psychological first aid following a critical incident or a disruptive event. That is part and parcel of a psychologically healthy workplace. What many organizations have found over these last 2 years is having a proactive plan, part of our business continuity plan, having disruptive event management as a standard feature of that versus a reactive response. We don't need to think about that because it's not going to happen here until it happens here. And then we're reactive instead of building it into part of the business continuity plans. Because if 2020 has taught us anything, and its least favorite sequel, 2021, it's not a question of if a crisis is going to happen. It's a question of when, how many, and how long is it going to last. And so crisis is inevitable, and we need to build it in. We need to learn the lesson from these last 2 years that disruptive events will happen. But if I have a plan to manage it, to provide the emotional support for my workforce, I can help avoid the small cracks becoming huge fissures because we've addressed it and they know we have a plan. And then we are providing support, tangible support, to the employees and to the teams and the organization as a whole. We are facilitating that resilience. So some practical steps that can come from that is recognizing that disruptive event management, by providing these supportive interventions, can be delivered both on-site and virtually. As we talked before, we're still in a point of transition. Not all organizations have returned to on-site work or office work again. Some are continuing to operate remotely. Some will operate remotely for the foreseeable future, and others are operating in a hybrid fashion. And so we have developed approaches that are both amenable to on-site response and hybrid response, being able to extend that benefit. But one of the key things that organizations have learned is making disruptive event management part of their standard operating procedures. So it's not, again, we'll call for this service when things get really bad. If people seem like they're really upset, okay, then we'll call for it, again, in a reactive way. But if they make it part of their SOP, their standard operating procedures, listen, when a significant event occurs, we're going to be providing DEM services. That's part of what we do. It becomes part of how we care for each other. That influences that culture of health. It communicates clearly that to the line workers, to the employees, that our well-being, how we're functioning, how we're handling it, matters to leadership, matters to the company. and that they have a plan in place to respond to our needs when something happens. And so part of that is, again, communicating that is there, communicating that that the company has built this in. This is one of the things we've learned, and one of the things we are incorporating into our new approach as we go forward. So some further best practices, some further long-term strategies that organizations are incorporating is recognizing that safety concerns right now are paramount in this current phase, in this transition phase. And by safety, I mean both psychological and physical safety. Again, we may feel quite confident about where we stand, not only in our traditional safety operations, but also our safety measures we've taken to address COVID. But that doesn't necessarily mean automatically that people feel psychologically safe about that. They may still have questions. They may still wonder. And particularly if we are not communicating transparently to the workforce about what steps we've taken to address their safety needs, their safety concerns, you're going to be constantly playing catch up. And so organizations communicating transparently about, here's what we are doing to address your safety concerns in a larger picture, and all of that builds in the culture of health. All of that influences and facilitates that culture of health. That also engenders the trust and engagement of the organization. That reinforces the sense of strength, of hardiness, of perseverance before the next crisis occurs. Knowing that we learned some things from the last crisis, that we are stronger because of that. Remember that post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic depreciation, and that those who recovered the quickest from the depreciation were those who grew the strongest because of that. The struggles we went through directly influences our growth. And so those who are able to, organizations that are able to highlight, here's what we learned, here's how we grew, here's how we are taking additional steps for your psychological and physical safety, builds a culture of health that can withstand the next crisis that's going to come. And we know there will be. We know there will be other crises. And so that helps build the hardiness. Prioritizing that culture of well-being by incorporating that asset framing approach and that appreciative inquiry. Make that part of our standard business operations. Make that part of our standard operating procedures. Being able to approach things from that asset perspective, that positive perspective, and asking questions that continue to build on that influences that care. And continually assessing, opening a regular dialogue with your employees regarding their needs and involving them in those improvement efforts. That kind of engagement gives them a voice, and having a voice is empowering. Think about it, having a voice, being able to have a sense of agency, of influence, following 2 years in which I felt completely out of control, in which I felt like I had no agency, in which I wasn't able to effectively change or influence things. It was kind of just getting by. And so being able to engage them in what are your needs and how can we help them and what suggestions do you have, that kind of improvement dialogue back and forth reinforces a sense of agency and a sense of control, which leads to an empowered and engaged workforce. I want to pause now at this point to see, Shane, if there are any questions or any other comments that have been brought in.
Yeah, we got a couple here. I will get you the first one. The first one came in just a few minutes ago, and I want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, we do have about 14 minutes left of this webinar, so please feel free to send them in. So our first one here is, how do companies balance being fair with the new hybrid schedules that do not allow everyone the perks of working from home? It can create low morale. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. No, excellent question. And a I'm not surprised because that is it is a tricky situation. I'm not going to pretend as if, well, here's an easy snap answer to that. I think the key thing that I highlight is going back to that mission, that purpose, and firmly anchoring a decision to operate in a hybrid way as an expression, as part of that mission. Why are we doing that? Because it fits. Not we're doing it because we asked and everybody said they want to. That's not part of the mission. That is purely reactive. If I say, listen, here's our mission, here's our purpose, and because of that, we've made the decision that hybrid supports that, carries that forward, moves the workforce in a way that carries the larger mission and the larger purpose forward. If I'm able to anchor it in that, then I think I can diffuse the issues around, well, it's not fair. It's not fair if it's seen as, well, it's purely personal choice. So-and-so got it, but I didn't. See, that is disengaged from the mission. So if I, as a company, am going to allow hybrid, I have to anchor it firmly in the mission and the purpose and determine, how does this move us forward? How does this help us more effectively accomplish our mission? And if it doesn't, then I may have to determine whether or not that is something that I reasonably want to do. Or if I think it does, then I can move forward, and that becomes part of the question. So it's not just seen as arbitrary favoritism, but it is part of our moving forward in the pursuit of our mission.
Perfect. And I think, I'm sorry. No. The next one that came in, I believe came in kind of earlier. We were talking about how the rises, the last few years, obviously we've seen a rise in depression, anxiety, other mental health issues. But this one comes in and says, can you speak to how companies can help address the huge increase in anxiety and depression in the general population? Great.
I think there is how do I say this? I don't want to in any way be misconstrued as if I am trying to find a silver lining through a difficult circumstance. So I want to be clear with that before I say this. But one good thing about the heightened awareness of how stress impacts our mental health status and how we're doing is that it has been, in many ways, the great equalizer. It has reduced stigma for so many organizations because, people used to be cautious or reluctant to talk about it because they were afraid of, well, what would somebody think if I said I was stressing? I think after the last 2 years, if you said, you know what, I'm stressing, everybody's going to say, well, join the club. We all have been. That's been a global experience. And in many ways, it has reduced the stigma and has made people more aware that, well, of course, just as I would attend to my dental health needs, my physical health needs, my vision health needs, I'm going to attend to my mental health needs. It's no longer seen as an aberration. It is seen as, well, yeah, if I've gone through stress, I'm going to address it appropriately. And so I think all of that to say that I think now is the time in building that culture of an emotionally healthy workforce to promote that message, to say, listen, we've all been through it. For leaders to say, listen, use our EAP or use some of the resources that we've developed to support the well-being and health of our workforce. And for leaders to say, I've used them and I think they're great. I've used them and I've benefited from them, to lead by example so that they don't say, well, this is for them, but I don't need it. For leaders to be able to demonstrate, listen, I've taken advantage of the resources and they're worthwhile. They are valuable. So I think being able to promote, now is the time to say, listen, these are resources we have on hand, use them. And that is part of our overall culture of health.
Yeah, I love that too, because it also, if anybody's attended other webinars of ours, I say this all the time, just from moderating and being a part of all of them, the common theme is communication. It doesn't really seem to matter what webinar we're in. If leaders, they got to communicate with the teams to be, make sure they feel they know they're heard, that they're not just by themselves out there, just like what Jeff was saying. And I think that's extremely important.
Again, yes, that rush to normalcy that we addressed earlier, the idea that, listen, if we just get past this, some leaders will say, well, I don't want to talk about mental health or, address this. Can't we just sort of skip past it as if and they miss the opportunity to build in that window, to build in that mental health is a key part of our well-being in the same way that our physical health is. And we've built in a plan for that.
Exactly. Yeah. This next question came in right off of the last one here. So I think this is this right on par. It goes, as an employee, how can you inform your employer the importance of hearing the voices of employees? How can an employee influence leadership to start assessing the needs and giving voices to employees?
I think that's a great question. And I think I would encourage you to use that appreciative inquiry as a way to frame your messaging back to the customers, back to leaders, to being able to say, what, here's the things that you as leadership or that the corporation did, or here's some of the ways that altogether we've adapted to and addressed. Here's what worked that got us through. But here's an idea of some other things that we think we can do that could be even better, or that can build on it, or that can take that the next step forward. Use that appreciative inquiry as a framework to structure your communications to them. So, because the quickest way, in any human interaction, if somebody comes to me and says, here's how you dropped the ball and here's what you need to do to fix it, is going to have much less of a welcome response than, wow, here's what's gone well, and here's something I think we could do even better. That's a forward, positive, asset framing type of communication that is more likely to engender buy-in from all parties, as opposed to I'm wagging a finger and expecting you to change and fix it. That's a great question.
Our next one here, and we do have time for probably one or two more questions. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to enter them in the Q&A section. The next one is, without shoulder surfing or getting overly micromanagerial, what are some ways to ensure that teams stay productive, especially in times of high stress?
I love that. I love that would be one of the, I think what you were highlighting and articulating was perhaps a negative habit, negative pattern that might have come from COVID. When folks transitioned from their normal work of on-site, where I could, pretty much see what they were doing, now that they're operating in a remote setting, I had a question about it. So I think, first off, pragmatically, is setting clear productivity expectations. So what is it that I expect them to do? What would the amount of effort to measure this as successful look like? What kind of output or productivity would I expect from them? And then I'm less worried about, did they do it within, the span of time that I think they should be allotted? If they did it, if they accomplished it, if they achieved the goals that I have set for them, that is obviously the clear indicator that they're proceeding. If they're not meeting those objectives, if those are not clearly stated in a way that I can measure it, then there's a problem on both sides. If you don't know how to measure it, why would they know how to measure it? So I have to be able to make sure that my productivity expectations are in such a way that I could independently track that, that I can make sure that it's going on without necessarily having to do that. But as we've talked about before, engagement and conversation, having that conversation with them to say, listen, I know, as we're coming out of this, there's been a lot of, patterns that we've all developed. I've done it too. As we're moving forward, what is the best way for me to support you? How can I support you in being successful in your position? I want to tee you up for success. What does that look like? How can we measure this? Come up with those goals mutually, and then set up a regular pattern where you say, okay, and I'm going to be checking in on you, once a day, once a week, once a month, depending on what is necessary for the achievement of that. But I'm going to be checking in with you to see how we're doing on those goals. And pulling them into that conversation and making them part of that is much more likely to get their buy-in and their engagement than just telling them, listen, I'm going to be checking in on you, spot checks, and you better be ready. That can be effective in some situations, but it typically makes the burden on the supervisor instead of having the employee own it.
Perfect. And I've got two more quick questions. I know we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left here. Just two quick ones before we can hop into closing thoughts. But the first one, I think coming off of these questions as well, is how can you balance listening to your employees' personal issues, but also not being their therapist?
Excellent call. And I think the key element there too is are they expecting you to solve it? Or do you feel as a leader that it's up to you to solve it? And oftentimes leaders can fall into that trap, because what makes a good leader? Somebody who can solve a problem, somebody who is used to, being faced with challenges and finding the solution. They're solution oriented. And so if I find myself trying to figure out how to fix it, then I've blurred the lines between being an empathic person who says, I understand that. What's the best way for us to support you? Here's the EAP number. Can we call that together so that you can get connected? Or call it, let me know how that works, and let's touch base on that again next week. Thank you for sharing that. I will keep that confidential, and we're going to move forward. How can I support you in being successful at work, even with that going on? Because being successful at work is part of how they sustain themselves. If I have a problem outside of work, one of the things that work provides is, here's something I can focus on. Here's something I can feel like I can get my hands around. Here's something that helps me feel like I'm in control, even if other areas of my life don't mesh with that. And so helping them recognize that that effective work is a stabilizing factor for them as well. So asking them the question, how can I support you in being most effective at work, even with that going on? And then highlighting other resources.
Excellent. That's perfect. So I got one more super quick one that I think will actually wrap up pretty well into your closing thoughts. So I'll ask that in just a moment. But before we do, with just our minute left, I want to invite everybody to our next webinar on Tuesday, April 19th. This webinar will feature R3 Continuum's Chief Strategy Officer and Chief of Staff, Linda Segue. The webinar will be titled The Interplay of Stress and Burnout, What They Are, How They Relate, and How to Combat Them. You can register today using the widgets and links on the screen, and more information will be sent out soon to you as well. So the last question, and then I'll kind of let you take over into our closing thoughts. Do you think that all of these suggestions that you're making, throughout the whole webinar, they can also be done, not only in person, but also virtually?
Yes. Yeah. I think one of the things that we've learned, and that I think we need to honor and celebrate, is how we were able to transition to a remote operating perspective from work over these last 2 years. Again, I am not in any way saying, well, that was easy, or we did that quickly and without any cost. Absolutely not. But I also think that we've come to learn that we are more adaptive than perhaps we gave ourselves credit for, and that we have been able to utilize these new tools. They are part of it. They're not going away. And so how do I leverage these new tools and in the service of my own continued post-traumatic growth? And to that point, I want to share with you just a closing thought from Judy Smith. And if those of you who aren't familiar with her, she an incredibly accomplished person, a crisis management expert, a CEO, and the thoughts that she has. This quote: there's always an opportunity with crisis. just as it forces an individual to look inside oneself, it forces a company to re-examine its policies and its practices. Or as a famous quote is, never let a good crisis go to waste. Use it as an opportunity for self-reflection or to re-examine the policies and practices of a company. We grow from these events, and that's my hope for you.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Jeff. That will wrap up our webinar for today. It looks like we went over just a minute or two, so thank you for sticking around a couple extra minutes. If you have any more questions or would like to register for our next webinar, you can do so with the links on the page. As I mentioned, some more information will be sent out, or you can email us at webinar@r3c.com. So thank you all for being here today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.